This episode of Raoul's Adventures in Crypto is sponsored by Masterworks. The AI boom is here, or is it? The markets are only surviving thanks to just 7 mega cap tech stocks. The equal weight S&P is dead in the water, up less than 2%. That's a larger disparity than the dot-com bubble. Billionaire investors like Ken Griffin warned the system was breaking down. But that's why this channel keeps you informed, because some markets are used as safe havens when volatility spikes, and Masterworks gives you access to a market currently surpassing its pre-pandemic levels, the art market. To date, Masterworks has sold over $45 million in fine art, including works by Banksy and Monet, returning the net proceeds to investors like you. Every one of their 13 sales handed back a positive net return. Over 730,000 users have signed up to gain access, so there is a waitlist. But Real Vision reached out about VIP access to their latest offerings, and we have a special link for you. Skip the waitlist and head to masterworks.art/realvisionfinance now. That's masterworks.art/realvisionfinance. See important disclosures at masterworks.com/cd.
So we're going to do something different with this interview. This interview is with Evan Cheng, who is the co-founder. He came out of Facebook on the Libra project and is the co-founder of Sui, which is one of these giant new layer ones. And I think it's a really interesting ecosystem. But the issue is I'm actually sit on the Sui Foundation here in the Cayman Islands, advising on where they allocate capital to develop their ecosystem. So I need to step aside and let Santiago Velez, who's much more knowledgeable in the complexities of new layer ones and protocols, to talk to Evan, and we can figure out ourselves what you think of it all as well. So again, I'm trying to be impartial and make sure that everybody's aware that I do have a vested interest in this. There's obviously no money change hands to do this or anything else. It's because they're a new large player. We've also had Aptos, who also came out of Facebook. They've been on the platform as well. It's all in the general manner that we believe that things should be done at Real Vision, which is everybody should have a voice. Okay, I hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to Real Vision, Adventures in Crypto. Obviously, I'm not Raul, not as good looking, but I'll do my best to fill in today. Full disclosure, Raul has some positions in the company we're going to discuss today in the ecosystem. So he invited me to speak objectively and explore this project for everyone watching. So I hope that we can all learn something together. This is the first time I'm doing a deep dive on this project. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce today Evan Cheng, who's the co-founder and CEO of Mysten. Welcome, Evan.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So let's first start off with kind of your personal background. Tell us a little bit about you, how you got into this space, Web3, blockchain, crypto, and then we'll get into a little bit of a deep dive on the protocol itself.
Yeah, so sure. I've been in the tech business for now, I'll say about 26 years. Did a bit of startups early in my career, then joined Apple for 10 years, that's where I made my mark. I was the person who is in charge with a lot of very, very difficult, low-level, bare metal type of software. And I received a 2012 ACN Software System Award for my work, along with my colleague Chris Ladner for my work in LVN. Just to give you an idea, that award is also won by people who invented things like TCP/IP, Java, web browser. So my software has reached billions, literally many, many billions of people. It's in every cell phone, every smart device, Android, iOS, every watch, smartwatch out there. So it's giving me a taste what the open source software impact can be and how powerful it is, right? Give me the thirst to do something big again. And after 10 years at Apple, I was recruited to Facebook, where I was building our organization. But then in a couple of years I sort of got the crypto bug. I think this is about 2017, maybe. I saw opportunity on both sides, right? One is, the opportunity for this technology to deliver massive impact to the world. And also my personal opportunity for delivering impact, because I saw some very, very critical mistakes in the design of, Ethereum and others, right? And I think that's unsolvable. It doesn't even seem to be a recognition of how broken they are, specifically things around stability. And more. and more. And so I saw, hey, this will be great opportunity for me to sort of do that again, right? Opportunity to deliver impact to massive number of people. Again, I love doing things that's hard. So that gave me this idea. This is something I want to take on next. So, but the tricky part is this is back in 2017, 18, and I look around, there's just not enough sort of the kind of talent I was looking for. I want to do some real serious R&D on this. I want the world-class experts in distributed system, in program language form verification, in cryptography, economics, and all that. And I wasn't finding those talent that's interested in this space, given how early it is, right? It's a bit also has a bit feel of a bit wild, wild west to a lot of people. So that wasn't possible. So I stuck around until the Libra Indian project came about, and then I joined Novi to basically run R&D, there. So that sort of started my official journey into the into blockchain crypto world. Fast forward a couple of years, in 2021, it was very clear DN wasn't able to deliver on its promise because regulatory pressures and other. My co-founder and I left to start Mysten Lab, and since then we built Sui and launched just a month or so ago.
That's fantastic. That's an incredible, very long, a view of a journey through all the different iterations of the internet. And of course, along the way, you noticed many of the problems for each phase. And one would argue that the problems that are occurring now in what we would call Web3, and we'll get into that definition as you see it, there are in some problems that you hope to solve. So first, can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the primitives that are used in each phase? You mentioned TCP/IP in phase one, and we had social networks in phase two. What problems and then what primitives kind of arose to help solve those problems and move on this iteration, this journey?
Perhaps you're talking about like how the internet has evolved, right? So, and I think it's very important to go back to the premises of the internet is actually peer-to-peer, right? So allow any two individuals to be able to connect, right? It's about the ability for anybody to create a efficient marketplace, right? So, TCP/IP is very, very low level, right? Primitive, right? You have built protocols on top of that for emails, for file transfer and all that. It's all very peer-to-peer. And that's powerful because it allows anyone to create a efficient marketplace. So you're not constrained. You're equally in the playing field. Fast forward to Web 2, well, it's not, right? The web is extremely centralized, right? It's going back to, power law, right? If you have the network effect, you have the distribution power, you get to control anything. Anything from content distribution, when you talk about Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, you name it, right? Almost every single one of these platforms is built on essentially the content created by user. User generate content, but most of the user never profit from them directly, at least, right? There's no transparency on how their data is being used for advertising. Then they actually can't take that connection out of the product, the platform, right? Think about it. Your social graph on Twitter, you can't really utilize it outside of Twitter. Same thing with all the other platforms, right? So it's becoming very centralized, and there's a cost, right? People don't recognize the cost is being passed down to the consumers, right? And if you look at more directly, say, application distribution channel, they all take a cut, right? Apple with App Store is dominant, right? They take a 30% cut on just about everything in apps purchase, take 30% or whatever percentage is, and also place a lot of restriction on what you can and cannot do, right? So it's like every layer sort of squeeze the layer above, right? They're using the distribution power to squeeze. Perhaps the more subtle is the harm it has on small and medium business, right? If you think about it, I bet there's studies out there, perhaps the industry should do more about this, right? small medium businesses, the lifeline is these kind of using social as a target customer acquisition channel. Well, so while great, the policy of app tracking has fundamentally, perhaps Apple and other will argue this for the good, right? You need to evolve with the time to care more about privacy. But the flip side of that is, well, attribution is far worse than before, right? We saw this directly. Snapchat still hasn't recovered, right? Facebook has recovered some, but not fully. Target advertising, far less effective, far more expensive. All these costs are passed down to consumers, right? It's also very restrictive on what you can do. So that's a fundamental issue here, right? When people talk about Web3, that's what's about, right? So can we go back to a world that's more peer-to-peer, right? And that's distribution, that's monetization. It's also about, even for brands, it's about reaching your audience directly, have that direct relationship, not through some middlemen that control access of the information. So a lot of things has gone wrong. And, this is a technology that could shift the balance of power a bit more towards decentralization or more peer-to-peer.
Hey everyone, Rails Venture Crypto, it's really my flagship show. It's where I interview the best guests in the world, people you never get on another show. I think it's the best show in macro, crypto, and Web3 combined. In fact, that's what it does. It covers everything. But really, it's all about the revolution in Web3 and crypto. And I'd love it if you got it every week in your inbox. All you have to do is just click on the link below, pop in your email address, and you'll get notified every time it comes out. And you don't miss anything as you take my journey into the exciting new world of crypto and Web3. Thanks.
So how does blockchain technology, and we'll get into your specific version of your vision, but how do you see that as solving the problem? What is it? The incentive systems that are broken? Is it the access to a software stack or protocol? What is it that is really broken? How can we fix it with this tech? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, let me give an example to illustrate that, right? So people talk about using NFT as a way for content producer to reach the audience, right? You can sell directly. So you have basically this triangle, right? Content producer or product producer, they have buyer, the consumer, and they have a platform that help you sell. Well, right now, if the seller, any one of these platforms, Instagrams and whatnot, right? You're at the mercy, how they monetize your goods, right? And how much do they take? The idea is for blockchain to disintermediate, right? To eliminate that and replace with software, right? Because if software is done, it doesn't have feeling. It's not going to change its mind. It's like today I decide to change my mind. I'm going to get more greedy, and then going to charge you more. And there's more transparency, there's more trust, right? So that's the whole concept of behind blockchain is disintermediation. And I can touch on that a bit more because it's nuanced, right? But I want to say this, right? And so far it hasn't proven to be true, right? Looking at the NFT sales, right? What happens? Well, it used to be, you pay royalties for secondary sale, right? Because we all know that's the lifeline of artists. It's not the primary sale, it's a secondary sale. You want to take a cut. The marketplace, right? These are controlled by human. They decided not to do that anymore, right? Not to enforce royalty payment because it's good for them, right? To have higher volume of trading, and look what happened, right? So the promise is there, the interpretation is wrong. Therefore, you results where it's still the same centralized entity in the middle, sort of controls everything. They utilize their distribution power for their own benefits. Again, right? I'm not like, hey, they need to make a business of it. They need to make money. But it's about fairness. It's about transparency. It's about an opportunity to, define what's right for you, right? For anybody producing content, how the content is being used and distributed.
Yeah, it's interesting that the very network effects in, let's call it Web 2, that gave to the growth of social media, these power laws, they were very beneficial to help us connect with one another. Unfortunately, those same network effects created kind of a disproportionate bargaining power between the owner of the marketplace or the owner of the social network and the individual participants. So, you get the issues of censorship or royalty splits, or, how it's monetized and who controls the data. So I agree with you that blockchain, this idea that you could disintermediate and still retain network effects. So you have public permissionless networks that could arise to facilitate the same kinds of connectivity, but without the compromises of having to give it to a single aggregator all of your data and all of your monetization, et cetera. So you saw Web3 as exists now. What problem exists with Web3, right? Because there's a lot of people working on solutions for this. What problem did you see that you thought, hey, Mysten Labs can solve it better than everybody else?
I mean, if to be frank, right? I mean, a lot of the existing blockchain models just wrong. I'm not even talking about scalability, performance here. Right? I'm talking about the data model as well as the programming model, right? In Ethereum, for example, EVM's most popular chain, right? Tokenization of content or assets is skin deep, right? You basically represent ownership on chain, where the actual contents lives elsewhere, right? So think about it for a second, right? The whole point is for smart contract to process assets for you, right? Not relying on human. Well, except you're not keeping anything on chain, right? Right. So, NFT is literally just URL, right? Pointing elsewhere. And it's off chain, the smart contract cannot do anything about it. Yes, there's ways around it, hack it, Oracle and all that is highly inefficient, right? And you can't easily change the asset, right? Remember, in the real world, everything changes, right? Today I have a baseball. Tomorrow, somebody signed my baseball. Baseball player signed my baseball. That's immediately worth a lot more. That mutation, the progression throughout the life cycle for anything that cannot be represented easily, right? And cannot be represented on chain, right? You're losing all that promise as a result for this, to be frank, weird and completely wrong data model. And people trying to hack around it, right? By all kinds of things that's just not to the point, right? And coming back to the other things, right, about the disintermediation, why is that so hard, right? Why is it so hard for software to enforce things like royalties, right? And this is the important part. When you really need to think about this concept, what makes an asset valuable, what makes an asset, right? It's all these attributes, all the information. If I have a character, is a level 1, is a level 10, this has weapons, is elf, is a dwarf, and all these things are made up an asset, in-game asset, right? And so these things are important, right? If you don't keep the information on chain, they all look identical, right? And also the rules around it, right? We talk about secondary sale of artwork, right? You as a producer should be able to define and say, I want to charge 5% for every secondary transaction, enforce it to software, not to human. And why is that not possible and very, very difficult on Ethereum? I know, again, there's an effort to hack around it with validator participating and all that, right? But those are hacked, right? So your programming model is wrong. Your interface, say this is ERC something, right? Everybody implement according to the interface, right? But interface is abstract. Implementation is done by individual teams that implement according to the interface. You don't know what they do. You can't enforce it. You don't know if they're good or bad, or they have a poison implementation. They claim to serve royalty, but they may not, right? So you fall back into social consensus. You expect all the humans to play by the book. That's just fundamentally wrong, right? Rules around asset transfer and creation, right, are parts of what an essence of an asset, right? So think about in things applying to securities, require KYC and ML checks before it can be transferred. Well, how are you going to do that with this model, right? Are you assuming everybody's going to play by the book? You can't, right? It has to be encoded, embedded. Secondary sale, royalty payment, copyright verification. These things are all essential. So asset has rules around them. So this is the fundamental problem with the blockchain data model, the programming model, everything associated with it, even ignoring all the challenge with, how inefficient they are and how expensive they are, right? Because if you can't do that, you cannot fulfill the promise of the blockchain. That is disintermediation, replace human in the middle with software. Because if you cannot trust software, these software, they're managing potentially billions of dollars. You need to be able to say ahead of time, prove them are correct. They have to be correct. They have confidence. Otherwise, you fall back to human, right? This is why a lot of tokenization effort looks like, well, we do primary issuance on chain, but then, by the way, we actually have to do all the secondary processing at consortium chains or whatever, because that's the only way we can control it and trust it, right? This is why banks use blockchain, but private setting, right? You have a fundamental mismatch about your intention and your technology. And this is why I think everybody will agree there's very little concrete disruption of products that we all use, from business or consumer side by blockchains today. Very, very few example. Maybe a bit of payment with stablecoin. That's quite great example because those things are simple, right? Stablecoin is stablecoin. You only need to keep balance, and it's a bearer instrument that's done. But anything more complex, right, where you actually need to enforce rules around it, you actually need to know what the asset look like, you need to compose assets, right, be able to track its life cycle, the changes of asset over time. It's really not that effective, right? Like people being hacking around and trying to make it work. But why? Fix the fundamental infrastructure.
Yeah, and it seems, at the root, there is a problem, the Ethereum virtual machine, which is kind of the machine that runs the environment on the Ethereum blockchain, and Solidity, the programming language, that's used in many L1s, not just Ethereum. But one of the fundamental problems, as I see it, is it's not object oriented, which, not to go too far into computer science, but it has some fundamental limitations that it can only be used essentially as a very sophisticated and immutable registry, right? It's just a indexing database that's shared publicly. And what you're saying is that you can have much more rich programming environments that not only can be shared publicly, but can be amended and can live in real time in the same way that assets live in real time, in changing ownership, changing content, changing everything that an object might be able to change if you're a developer, to generically incorporate all of these other elements that right now you can't. So it seems like for a period of time, there was a mismatch between the rate of conceptual development, all these great ideas about how to fix and disintermediate third parties, but the layer at the base really isn't sophisticated enough to realize that promise. And so you have to come in and kind of backfit with these hacks. So can you tell us a little bit about how your lab, how it fixes that problem, what is unique about it, and how you think this will solve the problem?
So if you look at Solidity, what was some of the things that are wrong with it? Dynamic behavior, with reentrancy bugs, right? You have delegation, you have all these things that basically make it not trustworthy enough, right? But you keep on finding bugs in them because, well, you just cannot analyze ahead of time to say this is provably correct, right? And that's a fundamental mismatch, right? In how you design a language for smart contract. You need to be able to trust it because these things are going to manage a lot of money for you, right? So that's a very, very fundamental problem. So even back in the days where at Facebook, we, recognize the need to have a much, much better, different smart contract language, no dynamic behavior, actually have asset as a first class concept, right? Allow you to have a language to describe all that, what an asset look like, not just a URL or balance, right? Something very, very basic. Ownership models are captured and modeled correctly, and use the runtime as much as possible to enforce these things, right? Because another problem in Solidity is like, if you forget some kind of ownership check somewhere, you'll probably be in trouble, right? So lots of bugs we were seeing about that, right? Hundreds of these kind of issues, right? Get all these things right and don't place a burden on developers, right? Because not everybody is a security engineer, right? And finally build the tools, right? have specification, has designer language along with the specification language allow you to formally verify the software is correct. It doesn't get better than mathematically prove something is correct, right? So all these layers of defense, right, it makes it much more expressive, much more powerful, and correct and safe, and all that sort of thing to do. Now, fast forward to Sui, right? Once we recognize, right, Sui needs to model objects, assets as object, right? So they're free flowing, right? And then we.
And is Sui a blockchain or a programming language, or both? A generic.
Sui is a blockchain, right? So
okay.
There's a ledger aspect and there's a programming environment on top of it. I'll get to that in a bit, right? And that's a very, very sort of high level concept of that, and it's not quite correct when it comes to Sui. But it is a blockchain, right? But Sui is a very different data model where everything is an object, right? It's a data store where everything is independent objects. And then you have address that own, where your own object live rather than having the data trapped inside smart contracts, right? So, but that model allow you to do something even more powerful, right? Because now objects are composable, right? You have language around that. Objects can be, passed and stored and can be combined. A lot of things you can do with it. The ownership model is much more powerful. You can be owned by a single person or unowned, like something like a smart contract everybody can access, right? So we iterate on that to match the data model to really come up with a completely different sort of concept, right? And the blockchain is also sort of think about things very differently, right? So for all the blockchains, you think about tracking the history of assets being transferred, right? I send you 5 ETH and you send John 10 ETH, right? You track the movement of asset. But the assets generally don't change, right? You don't track the asset change themselves. You can think about Sui as sort of another layer on top, right? You also track the state change of all these assets because, again, right, you're describing assets as a rich type, right? The type, character with level, with race, with experience and strengths, intelligence, right? These things change, right? So you also track the state changes on chain as well. So it's almost like it adds another dimension, right? Because objects are versions as a result. So so all that gives us a much more powerful framework to, solve the kind of problem we talked about.
So to me, this much more rich object-oriented asset types. This could include all types of content, like we talked about earlier, media content, NFTs, tokens themselves, but also within each object, the history of that object, right? That it's changed over time in its attributes and maybe ownership and or non-ownership. That was a very interesting concept. Now, doesn't this cause an incredible amount of congestion? How do you make this scalable? Does it horizontally scale, and why isn't it subject to the same kind of limitations that existing blockchains have?
Yeah, actually, we're far more efficient than any of the existing blockchains. Why is that, right? First, examine why blockchains are so inefficient, right? So you think about the programming model, it doesn't really track dependency, right? It doesn't track the dependency between the asset themselves, right? Because that's the way the programming works, right? It's very low level. Everything's loaded into address and all that, all in the smart contract, right? So when you're processing transactions, you basically have a block of transaction. Well, conceptually, if you think about it, let's say there's a 10 transaction that's sent from 10 different address to a DEX. There's 10 other transactions sent from different addresses to, say, an NFT mint. Conceptually, these two groups of transactions have nothing to do with each other. Okay. Why are you sequencing them with consent in the first place? Right.
Good point.
Also all the information, and then you try and say, I'm going to sort them, and then you try to do some hack and say, I parallel execute them. Okay, let's say if you are successful at that, but there's a limitation why you can do that because you don't have dependency information and to keep everything in the same address space, shared memory. And then finally, you store everything into the data structure of the Merkle tree. It's not just your transaction record, but also the states, right? Highly inefficient. Number of reasons why these things are so slow. Another thing that maybe people are not aware, maybe don't think about. Well, think about this, right? If, let's say, 10,000 of us all have a Bored Ape, right? All 10,000 of us are trying to transfer our Bored Ape to someone else, right? These are independent operations. In the Ethereum world, all 10,000 of us will be sending transaction to the same smart contract. Say, please update your internal map to update the address of the new owner. You see why this is horribly slow, right?
Just quickly, this seems like an original sin. In other words, when Bitcoin was first constructed, this UTXO model was designed to preclude the double spend. And so transaction ordering was very, very important because everything was fungible. You had to make sure that you couldn't send, one Bitcoin to Bob, another to Alice. But in what you're saying is that, look, we've got all these completely independent transaction operations that have nothing to do with one another. Why do you insist still on that paradigm that everything has to be sequential? Right?
So this comes back to how Sui is designed, right? Everything's an object, right? The programming model is literally passing in objects, assets, and producing assets and outputs, right? So you have the dependency information. So you know exactly, well, these 10 transactions are targeting a DEX, these 10 transactions are targeting the NFT mints, let's process them separately, right? And if you can process separately, you can parallelize the entire pipeline. This is not just about parallel execution. This is about ordering them separately, right? Then you can sequence, then you can execute them separately. Or by the way, you also have dependency information, make parallel execution very, very simple rather than try to discover it, right, dynamically. And then you store the state changes in the object rather than storing the asset changes in the Merkle tree, right? Because the record keeping is done asynchronously, separately, every couple of seconds or whatever number of transactions be met, right? That's not part of the processing pipeline, right? And so all these things make it very, very scalable. And adding to that, for own object, right? I own this NFT. I own the Bored Ape. I'm transferring to you, Santiago. Why do I need to sequence in the first place? Nothing is going to contend with this object which I own. No one else can touch. I just transfer to you. It gets executed and processed right away. You don't need consistency.
It seems the only limitation, this does seem truly horizontally scalable. It seems the only limitation is, I guess, the number of servers that you trust as valid to process their transactions. Is that correct? You could just add more computers to do these transactions.
Yeah, it's more of the concept of intra-validator scaling, right? So each validator right now is one machine or one core, but you can, scale horizontally to a number of cores, right? Because it processes things independently. Like we haven't need to do that because we haven't hit that kind of scale in terms of usage, but that's the concept, right? So it's a far more efficient pipeline, right? It's completely different about how blockchain works, right? Because it's centered around the object data models being different, programming model very different, how we store things are very different. The processing pipeline cut out unnecessary steps, like don't wait for everything to be written to a Merkle tree before you process the next thing, right? In fact, every transaction is processed immediately rather than waiting. Think about it, it's like I want to send a transaction, I want it to be processed right away. I don't want to wait to be grouped with a bunch of things that's not related to me to be processed together.
Is this still effective? Two questions, I guess. First, does this still have the same attributes that we tend to glorify in blockchain? Mutability, could be public, permissionless, etc. That's question number one. And then secondly, is it still as secure for high value transactions? Not having a large consensus, for example, to deter attacks. Can you talk a little bit about each?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with those properties. Yes, it's completely permissionless, open, it's verifiable, right? And in fact, right, we say we can build different kinds of light client very simply, so third party can verify things very, very simple. Because if you are a product builder, let's say I have a game, right? I know in this game I have 10,000 users, each one that has a character that's an object on the chain. You just track that 10,000 objects. You don't need to traverse the Merkle tree, find the information, dig out the parts, right? We call it sparse replay. Just read the things you care about, monitor the things you care about, right? So, there's no sacrifice on any of that, right?
Yeah, it's like, if I was going to sell my car, I don't need to go to the Library of Alexander every time and find exactly where that sale ad is going to go. Wow, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, and in fact, in terms of scaling the blockchain, and then the everybody's talking about trilemma as if that's the truth, right? It's like, scalability, security, and decentralization. Why is scalability a limitation, right? We just established, right? You can scale by adding more workers to each validator. So it's not scalability, it's actually latency. If you increase the number of validators that needs to participate in consensus, come to agreement, it's a latency, right? So, and also only impact latencies of shared objects, right? Such as, a DEX or something, right? If it's an own object, right, you process right away. It's a broadcast. It's ON, right? So it's a very, very different conceptual model. So a lot of things don't apply, but there's definitely no sort of sacrifice or trade-off in terms of security and all that, right? It's quite the opposite.
So for our watchers who don't understand maybe the technicalities of latency, we've got these computers and databases spread out geographically in time, and they all have to synchronize with one another, each other, to establish consensus, a shared state or truth that they can all rely on to make kind of forward progress. And what you're saying is that it's the latency is only a limitation because everybody's trying to do everything for all computers sequentially, and that if you kind of break that problem up into different worker nodes and have parallelization, you don't need to worry as much at all about latency. Is that a fair statement?
No, you don't worry about scalability, right? Because scale is, right, this is very important, right? So when you have infrastructure that's had limited capacity, you're going to have all kinds of problems, right? It's like, this is how we, describe it as a noisy neighbor problem, right? It's like your road in the neighborhood is congested because next door is throwing a party, right? It's not your fault, but you're paying for it, right? It's like when Bored Apes do a land sale where the whole Ethereum network congests, you pay higher fee because it's such a limited capacity, right? Infrastructure needs to be able to scale up to meet demands, right? So it's never a good trade-off to say you have limited capacity. That's definitely not the way AWS, these cloud services work, right? You don't think about it. Say, are you going to run out of capacity for me? Then my business goes to zero, right? Because you can't service me. No, it's a latency, right? Because when you have number of validators that increase at a certain threshold, right, their communication overhead increases. They will have an impact.
So this is really an incentive structure, if you think about it, because you have to achieve two things, right? You have to incentivize new workers or validators to support the network on demand, right? This kind of load balancing, real-time supply-demand balance. But you also want to incentivize network participants. Does this blockchain have a native token to achieve those functions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, actually, the tokenomics is all about that, right? Open market participation and competition, right? The validators want to get into the top 2/3, right? Remember, 2/3 majority of the staking power determines actually participate, consensus, right? The rest don't really do much, right? So it's never about the number of validators, really about the concentration of that 2/3 power, right? So you want to get into them, right? The way you attract more business is to provide better returns for staking by making more efficient, your service more efficient, right? You're cheaper, your cost is lower, you pass on more saving, earning to your customer, then you attract more stake and you get into, right, or maintain your top positions where you do that. Another thing they do is they do auctions every epoch to set the gas price, right? So you determine the reference price, right? So self-adjusting as a result. You try using the market power to drive sort of essentially a healthy race to the bottom, right? They need to make money, because anything that don't make money means somebody's subsidizing for it, right? Solana, others are inflationary, right? They have more tokens, so they incentivize validators, right, to keep the transaction gas low, but you're paying for it, right? Everybody is paying for it. So we don't have that. It's fixed, right? So it's about this healthy competition, race to the bottom, everybody improving upon their service, right? And you encourage more usage of the network, right? And then if you want to scale up, you scale up while keeping the gas price low, keeping the cost low, but you service more, you make more money, right? So all these things, right? This is more of a free market dynamic, open market competition kind of model.
I see. So this never would. So until you change the underlying structure of how the data is organized, decoupled from this serial or sequential process, until you did that, you then even the tokenomics wouldn't work out. That the incentive structures would be, you really have to fix the base problem before you can then scale up. So it seems like the approach you take, is necessary. There's really no other way to go about it.
I mean, I'm sure eventually there will be more iterations and more ideas around how to improve upon the networks and all that. That's now our focus right now. We plan to stay ahead of any competition, right? But this is why this is important to design all the components to work well together, right? Your data model, your programming model, how you process transactions, how you store states, how you think about, like client read path, and everything has to come together. Not just say modular, right? You pick your own execution layer, you pick your consensus data availability layer and stitch them together as if that works, right? Because then they actually may not work well together. So this is why a lot of the blockchain world has been stuck in that model. Front line blocking, everything is address based, right? And they have all this way of doing things that hasn't really changed. At a high level, they may internally do things to make it better. Some areas better here and there, right? You can pipeline things, you can do things that are clever to shave communication overhead and all that, right? Those are valuable, but you have a fundamental limitation that will hit. You're going to hit that fundamental limitation at some point in time.
Well, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things people are building on the network. Well, first of all, has the network launched? Is it public and available for users and developers to try? And if so, what kind of projects are being built on top?
Yeah, so it launched on May 3rd, so it's a month and 10 days so far.
Congrats.
Yeah, it's still very early days, right? We have a long, big pipeline of games. These are a lot of them like AAA, very, very high quality games, right? We think about games should just be games, right? Not just Web3 games. Incorporate elements of Web3, right? So that's exciting, and more of them are coming on board, right? So they're trickling in. You have the usual DeFi, you have the usual, other infrastructure, you have NFTs and all that. Lots and lots of clever ideas. A lot of DGen products are here. Bigger initiative, bigger products are coming, right? We believe for ecosystem to thrive, you need grassroots, active developer community, try out new ideas and iterate very quickly. But you also need product that bring the customer with them, bring the fan base with them. So all these things are coming together. It's been a very interesting first months and half. We're seeing and learning about what works well, what doesn't work well, what we need to do to help our partners to make sure their launch are successful. So yeah, all that.
And is the programming language on Sui also called Sui, or is there a separate name for it where developers can learn?
It's called Sui Move, right? This is a Move language that was developed back at Facebook for the DM and BBAR project. But we basically iterated, to adopt this object model.
It's interesting because that project back then, you briefly mentioned the regulatory atmosphere, and what's very clear now is, I wouldn't say everything is the result of the way the data structures are set up, but we certainly have a significantly higher number of regulatory attack vectors because of the way things were structured originally. Why do you think that maybe this approach might lower the attack surface, not just from a technical perspective, but maybe from a regulatory perspective? Can you comment on that?
I don't know if I can comment on that. Honestly. I think this is probably a question that's best for me to skip because whatever I say
Understood.
has no upside to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair, and that's one of the things that's struggling in the atmosphere here in the United States. Obviously, there's a strong regulatory push at the moment, but I think it's important that those attributes of permissionless public that is being retained here are going to be in the future the key attributes that I think regulators will be looking for to say, this is a vibrant, healthy ecosystem. It's a place where builders can build and brands can come and get exposure and really, protect the investors. So, yeah, I completely understand. I guess, last kind of questions. So you just recently launched, you've got people building on it. Where do you see this going in, 1 year, 5 years? DM was a very ambitious project. It was going to be global in nature as kind of this currency for billions of people. Is there something that could reach that level, that potential?
I mean, our goal is, right? So this is not just about crypto enthusiasts, right? That will benefit from speculation and trading, right? That has its value, right? Early adopter usually has a lot of value to push a lot of, they're very important in pushing technology forward, right? But this is about, when people talk about mainstream, this is one to go, right? We talk about, it's not just about bringing people to Web3, it's also bring Web3 to users, right? We want to impact product thinking, product design, so it will be less centralized, right? So ultimately, that's what Web3 is about. And that is a number of different category, right? Sectors, right? Yeah, we talk about gaming, right? Because gaming, one is, not as highly regulated as financial product, right? You can experiment more freely, right? Game assets can be closed loop, right? You may not have value outside the game, so don't have regulatory concerns, right? You can more freely experiment. So early on, you see a lot of gaming use cases, but you're going to start thinking along some serious commerce use cases and then financial product. I'm not talking about just DeFi. I'm talking about end-to-end consumer-facing financial product or institution financial product, right? Because ultimately, this is about disintermediation. You can think about disintermediation in two ways. One is you remove all the inefficiency in the product, right? Think about how payment works today is like, every step of the way, somebody needs to, be doing process during business hour, you take a fee and passing on the message to another one, right? It's costly, right? That's why border payments can take 6% up to 5 days, right? Highly inefficient, right? And think about all the other kind of product. Another example is like buying a house. You have to sign escrow. You have to give money to somebody else who take it and say, okay, transaction completed, I'm going to release the money, right? So these things are all intermediary that serve a function of providing trust. And that trust can be replaced with software that you 100% verifiable, right? So there's a lot of changes to come in terms of product, right? And all spectrum. So a lot of things we are doing is sort of work with partners on these kind of product, doing some of the experimentation ourselves, building some of the first party apps, and also providing key infrastructure, right? We're about to very soon launch ZK logging, right? Think about using your Web2 identity to create your, attestation on chain, right? Then you could log in with your Google and everything's done for you. You don't have to manage your keys anymore, right? And all that sort of thing, right? It may not be for the crypto native, or may not be considered okay if you have an account that's, have millions of dollars in it, but probably just fine for gaming, probably fine for commerce, right? Or other use cases, right? Lowering the friction of product, right? Imagine having that and plus sponsor transaction, all of a sudden you abstract away a lot of concept. Logging with Google into a Web3 app, and the app pay gas for you, you never have to think about crypto anymore, right? All these things we're building have powerful, kind of impact on how products are going to be designed, right? Which is going to be to keep doing this type of work to push the field forward.
100% agree. I think the measure of success is when everybody's on Web3 and doesn't even know it, right? That it's all abstracted and has become so ubiquitous. And the kind of the paradigm shift you mentioned in how businesses and products are constructed really is inverted. And so I share your vision there. Thank you so much, Evan, for coming on. I hope that we'll have you back on Real Vision soon. Keep going on the journey. Hope to see you again.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute blast speaking.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hey visionaries, thank you for tuning in. For more free crypto content like this, head over to realvision.com/crypto. You'll get early access to the most brilliant minds in the space to cut through the noise, get in-depth analysis, and get you ahead of the curve with unbiased insights.